My once tranquil creek transformed into a conflict zone the moment the HOA labeled it a hazard to children and forced me to drain it. Yet no one foresaw the outcome when that very water carved out a new course. Imagine if those responsible for demolishing your refuge suddenly witnessed their own homes sinking into a mire of their own creation. Water dribbled against my boots as I strolled along the creek bed, listening to the gentle murmur that had soothed me for the past 11 years. Above, birds sang while dragonflies danced over the surface. That modest stream winding through my backyard was the highlight of my home in Riverstone Heights. After long, exhausting days fixing other people's plumbing, I would sit by the creek and watch my stress simply melt away. "Mr. Jackson?" "Hey, Mr. Jackson." I looked up to see Timmy and Sarah Thompson waving from the edge of my property. The neighborhood kids often dropped by to catch frogs or watch minnows dart among the stones. "Can we search for tadpoles today?" Timmy called out. "Of course," I replied with a smile at their excitement. "Just be sure to return them when you're done." I watched them carefully hop from stone to stone, their parents trusting them to explore while I kept a watchful eye. The creek, though shallow, barely reaching my ankles at its fullest, teemed with tiny creatures that captivated the local children. I never imagined that this serene scene would soon spiral into chaos. A week later, the first hint of trouble arrived in a bulky envelope bearing Maple Valley Homeowners Association in ornate gold letters on the corner. Odd, since our community had never been under an HOA's rule before. Inside was a welcome letter explaining that our formerly unregulated neighborhood had been merged into the existing Maple Valley HOA from the adjacent new development. I frowned as I skimmed through the accompanying paperwork. There were monthly dues, strict architectural guidelines, and pages of rules covering everything from grass length to holiday decorations. At the bottom, a signature line ominously warned that failing to return the signed agreement within 30 days would be taken as acceptance of the terms. I set it aside, planning to ignore it. That plan held for exactly 3 days until Karen Westfield appeared at my door. "Good afternoon," she said, with a tight rehearsed smile. "I'm Karen Westfield, Community Standards Director for Maple Valley HOA. I notice you haven't returned your membership agreement." "I'm not interested in joining," I replied simply. Her smile remained unchanged. "I am afraid participation isn't optional. Your property deed contains a clause that permits HOA formation if 75% of homeowners agree, and that threshold has been met." "That can't be right," I argued. "I've owned this home for over a decade." "The clause was always present," she countered, handing me a highlighted excerpt from my property documents. Apparently, previous owners had never enforced it. "We're simply trying to bring consistency to the entire area," she added. I hesitantly signed the papers, my stomach knotting as I handed them over. "Wonderful," Karen said, tucking them into her folder. "Our first neighborhood meeting is Thursday night," she announced, while glancing over my shoulder at my backyard. "We need to discuss that unapproved water feature." "Water feature? That's just a natural creek. It's been here since before my house was built." "Whether natural or not, it's a safety hazard. The Thompson children might wander in and get hurt," she insisted. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The Thompsons routinely brought their kids here to play. They loved the creek. "Well, Mr. Jackson, unmonitored water features violate HOA rules. We'll address it at the meeting." Thursday evening found me seated in a folding chair at the community center, surrounded by neighbors, as confused as I was by this sudden takeover. Karen stood at the front, next to a man she introduced as Richard Westfield, the HOA president, and notably her husband. "We are thrilled to welcome Riverstone Heights residents into the Maple Valley family," Richard announced. "Your homes will benefit from our proven property value protection strategies." I looked around, Some neighbors nodded in agreement, while others appeared as skeptical as I felt. The meeting dragged on with debates about mailbox uniformity and approved fence heights. Just when I assumed they'd forgotten about my creek, Karen switched to a new slide featuring a photo of my backyard. Addressing safety concerns now. This unapproved water feature on Elm Street poses an immediate drowning risk to children, she declared. I rose from my seat. That's my property, and that's a natural creek that has existed for decades. I didn't install any water feature here. The bylaws state that all water features must be approved and fenced appropriately, Karen retorted, completely ignoring my point. It's only about 4 inches deep, I argued. Mrs. Thompson interjected, my kids play in that creek all the time. It's perfectly safe. Karen's eyes narrowed. Do you have liability insurance for potential accidents on Mr. Jackson's property, Mrs. Thompson? Her pointed question silenced the room. These rules exist for everyone's protection, Richard added smoothly. Your creek must be either enclosed with a locking gate or filled in within 30 days. After the meeting, I confronted the Westfields. A fence around a natural waterway makes no sense. Wildlife needs access. Wildlife is another issue altogether, Karen replied. Raccoons, possums, they can carry diseases. The creek attracts them to our neighborhood. My neighborhood? I've lived here far longer than you have, I snapped. Richard placed a hand on my shoulder. Listen, we're simply following the bylaws that everyone agreed upon. An inspection team will be sent tomorrow. I suggest you comply. The fines can add up quickly. I shrugged off his grip and walked away, my mind racing. Something felt deeply off beyond mere overreach. I pulled out my property survey and examined it closely. The creek entered my land from the northeast, coming from the direction of the newer development, coincidentally where the Westfield's sprawling home stood. Grabbing a flashlight, I headed upstream beyond my property line. In the growing darkness, I tracked the creek through a wooded gap between developments until I reached a small retention pond behind the new houses. As my beam swept the water, a metallic glint caught my eye. Wading cautiously to the edge, I uncovered a drainage pipe partially hidden by cattails, a pipe that fed directly into my creek. I retrieved my phone, snapped several photos, and then traced the pipe back toward the houses. It led straight into the newest section of the development, right where the Westfields and other HOA board members resided. Still piecing everything together, I ducked behind a tree when I heard an approaching golf cart. Through the leaves, I watched Richard Westfield pull up to the pond's edge. He stepped out, scanned the area carefully, then emptied something from a container into the water. After he drove away, I inched forward and shone my light on the pond's surface. Dead fish floated belly up where he had dumped that substance. My phone buzzed, a text from my neighbor Elaine. Check your email. The HOA just sent a violation notice, $500 fine for an unapproved water feature. Drain the creek within 30 days or incur a $100 daily penalty. I stared at the message, then back at the tainted pond. This wasn't just about safety or rules. Something far bigger was unfolding, and my little creek had become the center of it all. The next morning at 7:30, the inspection team arrived. Karen Westfield, accompanied by 2 men I recognized from the meeting as fellow board members. I watched from my kitchen window as they marched across my lawn without asking for permission. Good morning, I called out, stepping onto my porch. Can I help you? Karen announced. Official HOA inspection. Barely glancing my way. She was already snapping photos with her phone, pointing at my creek and murmuring to her companions. I trailed them around my property, growing increasingly irritated as they trampled my vegetable garden to get a better angle on the creek. "Those are my tomato plants you're stepping on," I said. "You'll need to relocate this garden anyway," Karen replied without looking up. "Vegetable gardens must be situated in backyard areas not visible from the street." "But mine is in the backyard, visible only from the side street," I countered, as she pointed toward the road at the far edge of my property. "Section 8, paragraph 3 of the bylaws," she declared. For 45 minutes they snapped photos, took measurements, and jotted down notes about my creek. Each time Karen discovered something, excessive wildlife attraction, non-compliant plant species, potential mosquito breeding grounds, her face lit up. "Those are native plants that naturally grow along waterways," I argued. "And moving water doesn't breed mosquitoes. Stagnant water does." Karen offered only a thin smile. "Are you an environmental scientist, Mr. Jackson?" she asked. "No, I'm just a plumber who understands water systems," I replied. "Well, I'm sure the board will take your expertise into account." After they left, I called Marta Rodriguez, the only lawyer I knew, who had helped with my mother's will last year. "HOAs have considerable power," she explained after hearing my situation. "Your agreement gives them the authority to regulate all visible aspects of your property." "But this is a natural creek, one that's been here longer than any of the houses," I protested. "That doesn't matter in HOA law," she sighed. "They can regulate anything you can see. You might fight it, but honestly, it could take years and cost thousands in legal fees." 3 days later, a certified letter arrived, a $500 fine for an unapproved water feature, with orders to drain the creek within 30 days or face an additional $100 daily penalty. That evening, Mrs. Thompson knocked on my door with her children trailing behind her. "We heard about the creek," she said apologetically. "The kids are devastated." Timmy looked up at me, his eyes rimmed with red. "Can't you save the frogs, Mr. Jackson?" he asked. "I'm trying, buddy," I promised, though I had no idea how. After they left, I spread out neighborhood maps on my kitchen table. Something about the Westfield's aggressive drive to eliminate my creek still didn't add up. I discovered an old geological survey online and compared it with current property maps. The creek hadn't originated on my property. It began at an underground spring near the highest point in the neighborhood, now hidden beneath the new development, including the Westfield's sprawling estate. The following day, I visited the county records office in hopes of finding more details about the development's water management plan. While poring over property documents, someone tapped my shoulder. "Fighting the creek battle?" asked Elaine Wang, my neighbor from 2 streets over. Her familiar face was a welcome sight. "How did you know?" I asked. "We're all in this together," she replied grimly. "They forced me to remove my koi pond last month. It had been there for 15 years. My grandmother cried for days because it reminded her of home," she confided. "I'm sorry," I murmured, suddenly realizing I wasn't the only one suffering from the HOA's overreach. Elaine glanced at the maps spread before me. "Find anything interesting?" she inquired. "Maybe. Did you know this entire area used to be wetlands? The developer filled them in to build these new houses." Her eyebrows shot up. "Even the Westfield's property, especially that section. And get this. I think they're redirecting groundwater through my creek. I found a drainage pipe coming from their retention pond," and Elaine's expression hardened. "You should talk to Dr. Martinez at the community college. He fought that development 5 years ago, warning it would cause drainage problems, but no one listened." That afternoon I met Dr. Martinez in his cramped office, surrounded by piles of environmental impact reports. "Of course I remember that development," he said, adjusting his glasses. "It was a terrible plan. They built on a natural spring system without proper mitigation." He then pulled out a topographical map. "See these blue lines? They represent underground water channels running right under those new houses and draining into your creek. I added. He nodded. Huh. Exactly. Your creek serves as a crucial relief valve for groundwater pressure. If you block it, he gestured dramatically, the water has to go somewhere, I murmured. Physics always wins, Dr. Martinez agreed. Water follows the path of least resistance. Armed with this knowledge, I attended the next HOA meeting. When resident comments began, I stepped up to the microphone. I'd like to discuss the environmental impact of eliminating my creek. Geological surveys show it's part of a vital watershed system that helps prevent flooding. Karen immediately interrupted. The association has already consulted experts on this matter. Which experts? I challenged. I've spoken with Dr. Martinez from the Environmental Science Department, and he insists that this isn't up for debate. Richard interjected. The violation stands. Next speaker, please. Returning to my seat, I noticed several neighbors casting thoughtful looks my way. After the meeting, Mrs. Thompson and 3 other homeowners approached me in the parking lot. We believe you, Mrs. Thompson whispered. Karen has been using safety concerns to control everyone. Last month she forced the Patels to remove their decades-old oak tree because acorns were a choking hazard. I'm fighting this, I told them, but I need help. That night, as rain poured down, I sat in my car across from my property, watching the HOA's crew work under portable floodlights. Men in yellow raincoats dug trenches and laid large pipes to divert my creek underground. By morning, my once beautiful creek bed lay empty and dry. Only exposed rocks and mud where water had flowed for centuries. I felt hollow as I walked the dead creek, gathering stranded minnows and placing them in a bucket. The Thompson children helped quietly, their faces solemn as they rescued what little life they could. Where will the water go now? Timmy asked. I glanced toward the Westfields neighborhood on the hill. That's exactly what I'm wondering. 3 days later, as the storm intensified, I was startled awake at 2 a.m. by frantic pounding on my door. It was Elaine, soaked through and wide-eyed. You have to see this! Grab your camera! She gasped. I followed her through the downpour to the newest section of the development. Turning the corner onto Maple Drive, I halted in disbelief. Water bubbled up through storm drains, flooding the street to ankle depth. Several homeowners were outside with flashlights, frantically trying to divert the water from their foundations. And there, at the heart of the chaos, stood the Westfields in matching monogrammed raincoats, Richard shouting into his phone while Karen directed neighbors to place sandbags only around their own properties. The sewers are backing up too, Elaine whispered. 3 houses already have flooded basements. I recalled Dr. Martinez's words. Water follows the path of least resistance. With my creek gone, the groundwater had carved a new route right under the homes of those who had altered its natural course. From beneath the shadow of a large oak, I snapped photos and videos, documenting every detail. As dawn broke, I observed something even more striking. The ground around several foundations was visibly shifting, with tiny rivulets forming between houses as the earth became saturated. The Westfields' grand house sat at the highest point, seemingly safe for now. But physics always prevails, and water, like truth, inevitably rises to the surface. They had no inkling of the forces they had unleashed, but they were about to find out. You have 30 days to comply. Those words from the HOA notice burned in my mind as I stood in the rain, watching my cherished creek. Lightning streaked overhead, illuminating water that had graced this land long before any homes existed. I couldn't sleep that night. Instead, I fired up my laptop and began researching. What rights did I have? What was this creek? Really? My simple questions plunged me into an unexpected rabbit hole. By sunrise, my kitchen table was strewn with printouts, watershed maps, property surveys, and county records. My eyes burned from exhaustion. Yet, what I uncovered electrified me. This wasn't merely a creek. It was an integral part of the Riverstone Heights watershed system, a crucial drainage hub for the entire neighborhood. "Look at this," I told my neighbor Sam when he dropped by with coffee. I pointed to an old map dated 1962. "Notice how the water naturally flows. It originates from an underground spring near the hilltop where Karen and Richard built their homes." Sam adjusted his glasses. "So, if they block your creek, the water must find another route. It won't simply vanish," I concluded. I needed an expert's opinion, so I contacted the local university. Dr. Martinez, an environmental science professor with graying hair and mud-caked boots, agreed to visit that afternoon. She walked the full length of my property, collecting soil samples and taking measurements. Rain dripped from her hat as she crouched next to the creek. "This is a textbook example of a natural drainage system," she explained as she scooped some water into a jar. "These tiny organisms indicate a healthy water flow. Disrupting this system could have severe repercussions for the surrounding area," she added, gesturing toward the higher ground where the upscale houses stood. "Our neighborhood was built atop what once was a sprawling wetland. Even though developers set up drainage systems, they still depend on natural channels like the creek on my property to work effectively. With that fact in mind, I asked for a chance to speak at the next HOA meeting. When I stepped up to the microphone, Karen's expression twisted in irritation. "I've been in touch with environmental specialists," I began, as slides of watershed maps lit up behind me. "This creek isn't merely scenic, it's essential. It diverts water safely away from our homes to prevent flooding," I continued, only to be cut off by Karen. "The association has already consulted with qualified experts on this issue," she snapped, tapping her manicured nails on the table. I couldn't hold back. "Which experts exactly?" I challenged. "I've phoned every environmental consultant in the county, and none have been approached by the HOA." A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. Richard Westfield cleared his throat. "That information is confidential. Let's move on to the next agenda item." After the meeting, as I made my way to my car, I heard someone call my name. It was Margaret Joe, an elderly resident near the community entrance. In a hushed tone, she confided, "I spent 30 years working for the county water department before I retired. What you said in there was spot on. They're making a terrible mistake." She slipped a worn business card into my hand. "Call my old colleague at the water department and mention Maggie sent you." A few days later, I met Tom Richardson from the county water department for coffee. He unfurled historical flood maps that validated my concerns. "Your HOA president lives in this area?" he asked, circling a section on the map. "This entire block was designated as a seasonal wetland until 2015, when the zoning was inexplicably altered." "How can that be?" I asked. Tom simply shrugged. "Money talks, but redrafting paperwork doesn't change the land. Water follows gravity, not HOA regulations." That same evening, an email from the HOA arrived. They had moved up the deadline for removing the creek and planned to send contractors the very next day. I felt a wave of dread as I watched the workers show up. The following morning, heavy machinery tore into my backyard, while Karen stood by her SUV with her arms crossed in a victorious pose. By sunset, the beautiful creek had been eradicated, rerouted into a maze of underground pipes. The barren creek bed resembled an open wound across my property. That night, a torrential storm lashed our area. I sat on my back porch, listening to the relentless drumming of the rain on the roof. Near midnight, my phone exploded with alerts from the neighborhood chat. Anyone else's basement flooding? Water seeping through Maple Drive walls. Sewage backing up in the downstairs bathroom. I donned my raincoat and boots grabbed my flashlight and ventured out. The streets were awash with water, yet I noticed something wasn't random about the flooding. It was concentrated around specific homes, especially those near Karen and Richard's properties. Acting on a hunch, I waded through ankle-deep water toward their street. What I witnessed made me gasp. Water was bubbling up through their pristinely manicured lawns like natural springs, and the ground around several foundations was visibly shifting as muddy water seeped out from under concrete. My phone rang. It was Elaine Wong. "My basement is completely flooded, and I'm not the only one," she said. "I know," I replied, watching as Richard frantically tried to shoo water away from his garage with a broom. "Look, Elaine, the creek water had to go somewhere. It simply followed the path of least resistance, right under the homes of those who diverted its natural course. Then, as lightning split the sky, I noticed a thin crack appearing along the side of Karen's house, widening as water pushed upward from beneath. My creek hadn't vanished. It had merely found a new route, a route that would soon force the HOA to face consequences they never anticipated. Yet, nothing could have prepared me for what came next. At dawn, sirens wailed through the neighborhood. Emergency vehicles lined Karen and Richard's street as crews pumped water out of flooded basements. I stood among my worried neighbors, watching the chaos unfold. An urgent message came through. "Emergency HOA meeting tonight at 7. By mid-morning, a news van had arrived. A reporter thrust a microphone in my face and asked, "Sir, you live downstream from the affected homes. Has your property flooded?" I answered truthfully, "Not at all. My property once featured a natural creek that managed water flow, but the HOA forced me to remove it last week." The reporter's eyebrows shot up. "So the creek was removed just before this flooding occurred?" Before I could elaborate, Karen appeared out of nowhere, interposing herself between us. "The timing is entirely coincidental. This is clearly a failure of city infrastructure," she declared as she yanked the reporter away to show him the emergency pumps in operation. My phone buzzed again, this time a text from Elaine. "Did you see what happened at the Thompsons' house? It's the worst on the block." I hadn't yet witnessed it. I headed over and found Sarah Thompson sitting on her front steps amid soaked photo albums and treasured heirlooms, while her husband Dean lugged waterlogged items to the curb. These were the very families Karen had used as justification to target my creek. "I'm so sorry," I said sincerely. Sarah looked up, her eyes rimmed red. "Our insurance agent just left. They won't cover anything because it's classified as surface water intrusion. The adjuster said we're in an unmapped flood zone." I helped them move furniture to higher ground as she explained how water had erupted through their basement floor like a spring, destroying heirlooms, including her grandmother's handmade quilts and the children's baby memorabilia. Later that day, the community center buzzed with impassioned voices. Every wall was lined with neighbors demanding answers. Karen banged her gavel repeatedly. "This meeting will come to order. Our first item is the unprecedented flooding event." Richard stepped forward, adjusting his tie. "The board has been in touch with city officials. This appears to be a city infrastructure failure." Then, several homeowners began shouting simultaneously. "My basement has flooded 3 times this week. Who's responsible for these damages?" one man demanded. Karen retorted, "Your homeowner's insurance." Another interrupted, "It's not covered because we're built on what used to be wetlands." Patiently, I raised my hand until Karen acknowledged me. "I've been researching our neighborhood's geological history," I announced, connecting my laptop to the projector. My presentation displayed historical maps from as far back as 1962, before any development began. Our entire neighborhood was built on natural wetlands. Developers Install drainage systems that depended on natural waterways like the creek on my property. When the HOA ordered its removal, they eliminated a critical drainage point. Karen's face flushed. This is absurd. Are you implying we caused this disaster? I'm simply stating hydrological facts. Water always finds the path of least resistance. In this case, it's flowing beneath the foundations of homes built on filled-in wetlands. I replied calmly. Richard stormed to the front. That sounds like a threat. Are you admitting responsibility for the damage? I didn't redirect the creek, I countered, locking eyes with him. The room erupted. Parents, who once claimed my creek endangered their children, were now facing thousands in water damage. Neighbors who had been silent during earlier HOA overreach began demanding accountability. Margaret Joe, the retired water department veteran, spoke up. I've contacted former colleagues at the county. They're sending engineers tomorrow to assess the situation. Karen protested. The HOA hasn't authorized any county inspections. Margaret replied calmly. They don't need permission. She added, this is now a potential public health emergency. The meeting dissolved into chaos. As I packed up my materials, Sarah Thompson approached me quietly. Our basement water keeps coming back no matter how often we pump it out. Our foundation is cracking. The HOA insists we handle it on our own, but we simply can't afford these repairs. How many other families are in the same predicament? On our street alone, there are at least a dozen, she said. We need your help. You understand what's happening better than anyone. I hesitated. Getting involved might make me an even bigger target for Karen and Richard's wrath. Finally, I agreed. I'll help, but only if, when the time comes, we vote in new HOA leadership. Sarah nodded firmly. Just tell us what to do. The next day, county engineers arrived. They took soil samples and conducted detailed ground surveys while I guided them, pointing out where my creek had flowed and where water was now pooling in unexpected spots. This is exactly what we warned the developers about 15 years ago, one lead engineer muttered. You can't fill in wetlands and expect water to obey human designs. 3 days later, an official report arrived by certified mail. Its conclusion was damning. The recent flooding was directly caused by the unauthorized alteration of natural drainage systems, specifically the removal of the creek at 247 Meadowlark Lane. I barely slept that night, knowing my address was singled out. The following morning, I stepped outside to find all 4 of my car's tires slashed. A note had been left under my windshield wiper, back off or else. Instead of cowing me, the threat only strengthened my resolve. I documented everything, called the police, and contacted the local newspaper. The reporter from earlier eagerly followed up, and within 2 days the headline read, HOA blamed for neighborhood flooding. The article detailed how the HOA had ignored expert advice and forced the removal of a natural drainage feature, causing property damage for numerous homeowners. My phone rang incessantly with calls from neighbors I'd never spoken to before. They recounted other HOA abuses, arbitrary fines, selective enforcement, and personal vendettas. One father mentioned he had to remove his son's basketball hoop because it was 2 inches too tall, while Richard's boat had been parked in his driveway for months, despite the same rules. What began as a fight over my creek had grown into a much larger struggle. The HOA had awakened a sleeping giant, a community tired of petty tyranny. That evening, as I helped the Thompsons install water barriers around their home, I noticed Karen and Richard watching us from their car. When they saw my gaze, they quickly drove off. The neighborhood group chat, then pinged with an urgent message from Elaine. Emergency meeting at my house tomorrow at 6 p.m. Do not discuss this chat. I sensed a revolution brewing. The water that once flowed peacefully through my land was about to spark a tidal wave of change that even Karen and Richard couldn't control. Later that night, as I told Officer Jenkins while he photographed my slashed tires, I handed him the threatening note in a plastic bag. "Any idea who might have done this?" he asked without looking up. "The HOA president and his wife aren't happy with me right now," I replied. Almost immediately, my phone buzzed with another text from Elaine. "Emergency meeting at my house now." When I arrived, people were packed into Elaine's living room, the air thick with worry and anger. Sarah Thompson whispered, "Our kid's bedroom ceiling caved in last night," showing pictures of drenched stuffed animals and ruined books. Michael Rodriguez stood up, his hands trembling as he pointed to 3 feet of water in his basement. "My daughter's quinceañera dress, my grandmother's treasure, is gone," he added. Taylor Williams chimed in, "My insurance is dropping me. They're now calling our homes high-risk flood zones." The room exploded with stories of ruined family photos, mold creeping up walls, and cars mired in mud. Elaine said, "Karen insists it's a city problem, but I recalled a city engineer telling me privately it was all due to the creek diversion." I spread out old property maps on Elaine's coffee table. "These show the original water channels before all the development," I said. "Look familiar?" Everyone leaned in. The flooding pattern matched exactly where water once flowed naturally. "The HOA has violated at least 6 environmental regulations," I explained. "I've been speaking with a reporter from the Tribune who's interested in our story." Elaine responded bitterly, "We tried playing nice. Where did that get us?" I pointed to specific spots on the map. These 7 drainage points allowed natural water flow. When they built over them, they installed drainage pipes that were never meant to handle this volume. "What if we just repair them?" Michael suggested. "Let's do that." We formed a secret group chat, dubbed the Weekend Gardening Club, to avoid drawing suspicion. On Saturday morning, about 20 of us gathered with shovels, pickaxes, and wheelbarrows, claiming to work on the community garden plot. We split into teams, and my group tackled the drainage point behind the community center. We dug through compacted soil, revealing the original stream bed. "Look at this," Sarah called out, holding up a discarded piece of plastic. They had literally buried the natural drain under construction debris. We labored all day under the blazing sun, our shirts soaked with sweat. Even old Mr. Jenkins showed up with lemonade, and the kids turned rock carrying into a playful contest. Around 4 p.m., a black SUV screeched to a halt at the edge of the common area. Karen leaped out, her face contorted in rage. "This is vandalism. I'm calling the police." I walked over calmly, covered in mud, but managing a smile. "Hello, Karen. We're simply maintaining proper drainage as outlined in Section 12.3 of the HOA bylaws," I explained, handing her a laminated copy. She sputtered, "This isn't maintenance, it's destruction." But by then, other neighbors had gathered around. "Is it really destruction to prevent our homes from flooding?" Taylor asked, stepping forward. "Or is it worse to ignore environmental experts' warnings and divert a natural creek?" Karen's husband, Richard, appeared and pulled her aside as the crowd swelled. As dusk fell, dark clouds gathered with a forecast of heavy rain overnight. We worked even faster, completing 3 crucial drainage channels. "Do you think it will work?" Elaine asked, as we packed up our tools. Thunder rumbled in the distance. "There's only one way to find out," I replied. That night, rain battered my windows. I lay awake wondering if our efforts would help or worsen the situation. At dawn, I donned my boots and raincoat and walked through the neighborhood. Where there had once been chaotic street flooding, water now flowed smoothly through our newly restored channels. I followed the main waterway all the way to its terminus, right into the Westfield's backyard. There, where Karen once hosted her award-winning garden parties. A pristine pond now shimmered with gently flowing water, exactly as the original wetland had been. At the very edge of the new pond, Karen stood, staring at her reflection in disbelief as cameras flashed while a local news crew filmed her new backyard oasis. A reporter declared, "Homeowners claim HOA negligence led to neighborhood flooding," microphone in hand. Karen barked, "Turn those cameras off. This is private property." "Actually," the reporter replied, "we're standing on a community easement per county records." She managed a tight smile. When asked if she would comment on reports that the HOA ignored environmental warnings before redirecting a natural waterway, Richard stepped in, pulling Karen aside. "No comment. We'll issue a statement through our attorney." That evening, the story aired. By morning, my phone buzzed non-stop with messages from neighbors I'd never even met. An official email from the HOA declared, "Emergency HOA meeting tonight. Attendance is mandatory. Failure to attend will result in automatic approval of all measures." The community center parking lot overflowed with cars. Inside, every seat was occupied by homeowners clutching papers and sporting angry expressions. Richard and Karen sat at the head table with the rest of the board, their faces tight with stress. Richard banged his gavel 3 times. "This meeting will address the unauthorized landscape modifications that have harmed our neighborhood's aesthetics and property values." Michael Rodriguez, from the back, stood holding his phone. "I've been on with FEMA all day. They're considering classifying our flood damage as a man-made water diversion disaster." Murmurs ran through the crowd. Taylor Williams added, "My insurance company is thinking about a class action lawsuit against the HOA for knowingly creating hazardous conditions." Karen's face reddened. "These accusations are baseless. We followed proper procedures." Elaine then stood up, clutching a thick folder. "I have copies of the environmental impact study submitted before the creek diversion. It clearly warned that disrupting the natural watershed could lead to flooding." She began handing out copies along with emails that showed the board had received and ignored these warnings. Richard slammed his gavel again. "Those documents weren't meant for public distribution." "They weren't meant to be hidden either," I countered, stepping to the front. "Public records laws allow anyone to access them. I also have the original permits showing that the Westfields' homes were built on protected wetlands without proper authorization." The room exploded with outrage. Parents whose children had been traumatized by flooding, elderly residents who had lost irreplaceable belongings, and families forced to live in hotels, while mold was removed from their homes, all shouted their questions. Sarah Thompson pushed forward. "My kids can't sleep at night. They're terrified water will seep through the ceiling again. Who's going to pay for their therapy?" Richard tried to regain control, but his voice was drowned out. I even saw him exchange a worried glance with Karen. Finally, Taylor Williams climbed onto a chair and whistled loudly, quieting the room. "We've prepared a petition," she announced, waving a stack of papers. "It calls for immediate board elections and has been signed by over 3/4 of the homeowners, enough to force a vote tonight." Karen grabbed the microphone. "This is ridiculous. We've maintained property values and community standards. Without us, this neighborhood would fall apart." Then, an elderly man, whom I'd never seen before, slowly rose. "My wife and I have lived here for 30 years. We watched as they filled in the wetlands to build those fancy houses. Nature always wins in the end. You can't fight water. It goes where it will." The vote was overwhelmingly in our favor. Elaine became president, with Michael and Taylor joining the board. Their very first act was to approve a comprehensive water management plan that included restoring my creek. 4 months later, I sat by my once again flowing creek, watching tadpoles dart among the rocks. Sunlight danced on the water, sparkling along banks where native plants had returned. Neighborhood kids had built a small bridge downstream, keeping a watchful eye for frogs. The Westfields had sold their house at a loss and moved away, and the new owners embraced the wetland restoration project, adding bird feeders to attract more wildlife. "It seems like it was always meant to be here," Elaine remarked as she joined me by the creek. I nodded, dipping my fingers into the cool water. "By the way, how's that class action lawsuit progressing?" "Settlement talks start next week. The HOA insurance is covering most damages," she replied. A blue heron landed gracefully at the water's edge, eyeing its reflection before swiftly catching a small fish. "You know," Elaine said quietly, "Karen left something behind when she moved." "What's that?" I asked. "A sign. It was tucked away in her garage. It read, 'Danger, water hazard, keep children away.'" Elaine smiled. "I put it up by the community garden and added a new sign underneath that says, 'Nature.' Not a threat, but a teacher." I laughed as I watched the water flow freely, exactly as it was meant to. Sometimes justice isn't delivered by courts or strict rules. It comes simply from letting nature take its course. What would our world be like if we stopped fighting against it and started working with it instead?